Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Robert J. Allison, Chair of the History Department at Suffolk University in Boston, where he's been teaching since 1992. Not a bad start. And his research spans history from colonial period to 19th century. He's the author of many books and the recipient of many awards, including awards for teaching. Perhaps the most notable broadband today is that he is a trustee of the USS Constitution Museum in Charleston, Massachusetts, and also the president of his local historical society in South Boston. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Allison. Please come and welcome him.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Beth. Let me put this on. I can't use a hand mic because I wave my arms around my book. A couple of hundred years, when people start studying speeches of the late 20th century, they will realize that most of them began with someone saying, "Is this thing on?" It's really a pleasure to be here in Lincoln and to actually meet with the Lincoln Historical Society. And sometime in spring, Jason contacted me to see if I would be interested in coming here. And of course I was. Then it was a lonely beat that I don't get something from Jason about what the Lincoln Historical Society is up to. And I've been astonished at the range of materials that the volunteers here have found on Lincoln in the War of 1812. It's really inspiring. As you mentioned, I'm president of my local historical society, and we all do need volunteers. And the work historical societies do is really essential to understanding history and to remembering history. You know, we professional historians have it easy, and we actually get paid for doing what a lot of people do out of love. And that's a great thing about historical societies like this, that we can all find out about our history and share it with others. So I'm inspired by the Lincoln Historical Society. Now, the War of 1812, I was also a little worried because the amount of things I have learned about Lincoln in the War of 1812 to make me think that I'm the one person in the room who knows the least about this. And so I worry that you already know everything about Lincoln, the War of 1812, and so on, and you're here somehow to mock me. The War of 1812 is a fascinating war. Didn't you know anything more about it, by the way? I want to weed out the expert.
After your book,
Did we?
I read report about 1812.
Okay.
He wrote to it by sea previous book.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I think I know what you're talking about, but typically, reviewing the New Yorker, the two recent books on the War of 1812. Yeah, as Jason said, I am on the board of trustees of the USS Constitution Museum, and we've been planning a series of events commemorating the War of 1812. And initially, when we started this a couple of years ago, think, okay, in 2012 we'll do this, then in 2013, 2014, 2015, because the war went on for 3 years. In fact, the USS Constitution's last battle in the war was in the late winter or early spring in 1815. But then someone in the committee realized that after 2012, people will resume their not really caring about the war of 1812, those who had mustered up any interest at all. So all of our work will be done by the end of this year. In Canada, it's a different story. Is anyone here Canadian? Oh, this is why you should read all these books. Canadians love this war for a number of reasons. I made the mistake. I was giving a talk a while ago about the War of 1812, and there was a Canadian in the audience. And when I said, "Is anyone here Canadian?" he raised his hand, and I give you credit, sir, because this guy didn't stop talking. I had to do it equal times. And I think I have to go back to rebut what he was saying. The Canadians, there are lots of anomalies about the War of 1812. The ostensible purposes of the war, that is, if there was a bumper sticker in 1812, explain why Congress and the Madison administration put for war, it would have said free trade and sailors' rights. And we'll talk more about what that means in a bit. The peace treaty at the peace treaty at the end of the war does not mention either of those goals. One of the clauses, free trade, the British had actually met the American objection before the war began. That is, our objection to British policy was the British Empire was not allowing Americans to trade with anyone the Americans chose, and that included the French Empire. You know, England and France had been at war pretty much on and off for 20 years. And the Americans did very well by trading with both of them. So, send a ship to British territories, send a ship to French territories, sell stuff. The Americans were doing quite well, and the British and French wised up to this. So the French said, anyone trading with our enemies, we'll consider them to be in violation of neutrality. They're not really neutral. We'll seize the ships and just use the cargo, sell the cargo on our own. And so this essentially closed all British ports to American ships. And then the British said, anyone trading with our enemies, we will seize their ships, and so on. So the British and French thought that this neutrality the Americans professed was a sham and would seize American ships. The Americans insisted on free trade and trying to back that up when you have England with the largest navy in the world and France, which by 1812 controlled the entire European continent, was a difficult proposition. In June of 1812, the British government decided to no longer harass neutral shippers. They would let Americans trade with whomever they wanted. So one of the reasons for the war was eliminated by the British government in June of 1812, just a couple of days before Congress in Washington declared war on England for this very reason, that is, English policy was attacking American shipping. News traveled slowly, of course, in 1812, and no one in Washington knew this when they declared war. The other reason, sailors' rights, the British government maintained the right to stop American ships and take off deserters, or men they claimed to be deserters from the British Navy. And Britain had been at war for, as I said, 20 years. The British Navy was a tough place to be. In fact, being life at sea was really tough. Samuel Johnson said the only men who go to sea are those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. Going to sea is like being in prison with the added possibility of drowning. So, in the best of circumstances, life at sea was difficult during wartime, particularly if you were in the British Navy. I should have asked if you here served in the Royal Navy. A tough place. So, when there was an opportunity, yes, some British sailors would desert. And the British, this was an era before passports, before ID cards and other things. So my way of determining who here is a British deserter would be to look around and see who are the most able-bodied among you and say, I remember you from, bringing such and such, and, you remember you, and you too, and can you prove that you're not a British subject and a deserter from the British fleet? Can you? Any of you? No. Okay, so the United States objected to this impressment of sailors, and the problem was that the British government would never renounce their power to do this. They simply said, we will never renounce our power to impress people, or to take back men who have deserted. And one myth about the war that the British did was, early in the war, first few months of the war, there are a number of single ship engagements between American frigates and British frigates, and the American frigates win. In August of 1812, the Constitution defeated the Gary, and in October, the American schooner Wasp defeated the British ship Frolic. And then in October, the American frigate United States defeated the British frigate Macedonia. And then in December, the Constitution defeated the Java. So you have a number of these single ship engagements. And one thing the British said as a way of trying to overcome the fact the Americans kept winning was, well, of course, their crews are all British deserters. That's what you said. It's not true, actually, but it comforted the English to think this. No, the British government, as I said, is not going to renounce impressment. The other thing about this is these are the stated reasons for the war. But New England, the section of the country most interested in free trade and sailors' rights, that most sailors would come from New England. Now, New England, as we know, has a tough climate. People had big families. There are not a lot of opportunities to start farms, and so people would go to sea. And also, New England was most heavily involved in trade with the rest of the world. So you would think a war for free trade and sailors' rights would have New Englanders enthusiastic, but New England opposed the war. In fact, the town of Lincoln was one of the few in Massachusetts to support the war. The war was very unpopular in most of Massachusetts, except for farming towns like Lincoln, which tended to support it. It's a story for another day, I suppose, about the political tensions in Massachusetts between the Federalists and the Republicans. Feeling ran so high, that in 1820, the Federalists in Massachusetts found a good way to get rid of the Republicans, as the fastest growing part of the state was Maine. And Maine was also heavily Republican, and the Federalists in this part of Massachusetts decided to let Maine secede, get rid of all of those pesky Republicans, and this part of Massachusetts remained Federalist, except for pockets like Maine. Anyway, so New England, you would think, would be hot for the war, but New England is against the war, so much so that in 1814, the New England states threatened to secede from the Union, led by Massachusetts. The Massachusetts legislature called for a convention to meet in Hartford, delegates from the New England states that would draw up their demands to the Madison administration and say, if you don't meet our demand, we will leave the Union. Now, at this time, when the New Englanders are calling for this convention, the British have burned Washington. There is a 10,000-man British army massing on the Canadian border, about to come down Lake Champlain and push through the Hudson River Valley and take New York. The British army that had burned Washington was on its way to Baltimore and Philadelphia. And then there's another British army making its way across the Atlantic. These are the soldiers, Wellington's soldiers, who had defeated Napoleon's army in France. So we know Napoleon, greatest general in the world. These are the men who beat his armies in France. Wellington thought the war was a foolish thing for the British, so he said he wasn't going to be part of it, but his soldiers were on their way. They were going to come to the Mississippi River Valley and join up with the Creeks and other Native Americans who had been fighting a war against the United States and wrest the western part of the United States from the United States. The United States would pretty much be left as Virginia and maybe some parts of North Carolina. And then Pennsylvania and New York would be separated. New England would be separated. That would pretty much be the end of the country. In fact, former President Jefferson, whose policies in many ways brought on this catastrophe, wrote letters of advice to President Madison about what to do once the Union was no more. So, in many ways, the war is a disaster for the United States. As I said, New England is threatening to secede. Washington is burned. In fact, one of the unstated reasons for the war, the section of the country most interested in the war actually was Kentucky and Ohio and places like that. And what they really wanted was to get Canada. And Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, a congressman from Kentucky, said that the Kentucky militia on its own could take Canada in a matter of weeks. And Jefferson said taking Canada will just be a matter of marching. All you need to do is march up there, and the Canadians will rally to us because everyone hates the British government. And all we need to do is show up, and the Canadians will join. Well, not only does the United States fail to take Canada, but in August of 1812, forces from Canada take Detroit. And Native Americans allied with the Canadians take Michilimackinac, this straits between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, Fort Dearborn, which is today Chicago, and all of the other western outposts of the American government. So the Kentucky militia is unable to take Canada, and one reason the Massachusetts government opposed the war is Governor Caleb Strong says the war really isn't about free trade and sailors' rights. The war is an attempt to get Canada. And when President Madison tells Governor Strong that we need to send the Massachusetts militia to protect the Canadian border against an invasion, Strong says absolutely not. What you want to do is get the Massachusetts militia out of Massachusetts so we can't defend ourselves when you send an army to kill all of the Republicans here. Or all the Federalists. You wouldn't believe the Madison administration was going to do. So, in many ways, the war is, well, in most ways, the war is a disaster for the United States, which is one reason I think the bicentennial observances have been a little muted. Now, the Canadians are quite celebratory about it, and some Canadians say this is our war of independence, and their independence from us. You know, who would want to be independent of us? I mean, no. Why? Anyway, this is the story. My friends in the historical community in Boston have been trying to drum up enthusiasm for the war, and it's been a tough sell, I have to tell you. I'm really delighted to have this group here. Now, you can learn, as historians, you know, well, and as humans, you know, we learn more from mistakes and disasters than from when things go right. When things go right, we often don't get the lesson of why they went right, but when things go wrong, we can look at why things went wrong. And the Madison administration does learn some things from the war. One is this: the whole premise of the Madison and Jefferson had been to limit the scope of the federal government. That's I'm not going to engage in contemporary political debates today. I'm just going to say that Jefferson took office in 1801 with one overriding goal, and that was to pay off the national debt so that one generation would not bind the next. The debt incurred in fighting the Revolutionary War, he thought it was a moral obligation on the part of the government of the United States to pay off so the next generation would not be saddled with this burden of debt from the previous one, but they would be able to pursue their own destiny. And that's a worthy goal. And I should point out, before we get carried away, that they do this. They succeed in paying off the debt. And they do it without raising taxes. Phenomenal story here. In fact, in Jefferson's second annual message, he asked, he basically said, we don't have anything more to do because we've set in motion everything that needs to happen. And so now there's really nothing Congress needs to which Congress needs to turn its attention. And in his second inaugural address, he asked rhetorically, what farmer, what shopkeeper, what mechanic ever sees the face of a tax collector of the United States? Jefferson was fond of rhetorical questions, which only had one answer, and of course the answer is none. So the United States government does pay off its debt without, we'll tell you later how this happens, maybe in the question period, and someone's going to launch his or her own political career using Thomas Jefferson's playbook. They also purchased Louisiana, fight a war against Tripoli, a war against England in the process, but still within 20 years have paid off the debt. So that's a good thing. Now, one way you pay off the debt is by not spending money on anything else. So the Jefferson administration severely cut the federal budget. He thought it had become bloated under the Adams administration, which spent $6 million in 1800. And Jefferson thought it was absurd for the government of the United States to be spending so extravagant as that. And his administration would look first at how much revenue came in and then adjust the budget accordingly, and using about 2/3 of the budget to pay off the interest and principal of the debt. I'm sorry, I didn't need to talk about finance here. But we have actually, I guess you're a town manager from a neighboring community. I know they'd be interested in how you can manage finance like that. So, one thing Madison recognizes that some of the things the government of the United States did not do, maybe it should have, like build roads and canals and so on. That's a subject for another day. See, someone's falling to find out how to do this. Anyway, I'll just tell you some more things that happened as a result of the war rather than rambling on about Jeffersonian financial policy. The United States, after the War of 1812, does not try to get Canada. It had been kind of an unstated or sometimes stated goal of the United States to acquire Canada. After the War of 1812, there is no longer a stated objective on the part of the United States to take Canada, and ultimately, the two countries, when Canada does become part of the British Commonwealth in the late 19th century, the two countries will enjoy the longest unfortified border in the world, which is quite an achievement. Canada, the United States, not get Canada. Indirectly, as a result of the war, the United States does get Florida. So we don't get Canada, we do get Florida. I don't know if we want to put this to a vote. Another thing, very important, the war with Britain was declared in June of 1812. The United States already was at war with the Shawnee Indians. In fact, in 1808, 1809, 1810, 1811, a Shawnee warrior named Tecumseh had created a confederation of Indians. The Shawnee, the Miami, the Wyandotte, Sioux, that is stretching from the Ohio River Valley west of the Mississippi River and then down to the creek, who lived in essentially what is today Alabama and western Georgia, creating an alliance of these native people against the Americans. And they were armed by the British, both from Canada and from West Florida, from the base of Pensacola in Florida to arm the Creeks, and from Canada to arm the Shawnee and so on, creating this Indian alliance which would prevent any white settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains. The Creek and the Shawnee have the biggest Indian alliance native people ever created in North America. Beginning before the war with England begins, and it's an unstated problem for the United States. Well, not unstated, really unstated to subtly, that the English are arming the Indians against us. In fact, in 1811, the Indiana's militia attacks a Shawnee settlement. Tecumseh had a brother who was a prophet, that is a holy man, whose name was Tenskwatawa. Actually, his name had been Lalowazito, which means loudmouth. And he was a quarrelsome, troublesome guy who drank too much, and then he had a religious awakening. And he began preaching this doctrine of not using white man's things, going back to our traditional ways. We should stop drinking, we should stop selling land, we should treat our children better, all worthy things. And also give up the tools of the white man. And he was called then Tenskwatawa, which means the open door. And because he said he had passed out, he had been taken up to heaven where he met the Great Spirit, a man who was the son of the Great Spirit, who told him all of these things. So he comes back preaching this doctrine, which acquires quite a following among the Shawnee and other native people. And he is called the prophet. And there's one story, the governor of Indiana was quite worried about the prophet. And he tells a group of Indians, he says he's a prophet. He says he communicates with the Great Spirit. Well, tell him to have the Great Spirit perform a miracle if you really can communicate with him. It's a pretty stiff challenge. It turns out there was going to be a solar eclipse within the next week. And so the prophet, when the sun starts disappearing, said, yes, I have spoken to the Great Spirit, and he's going to make the sun disappear. This is actually one of the oldest tricks in the book. Columbus pulled this back in 1493 on native people, saying, I'm going to make the sun disappear. And it's quite a terrifying thing. You don't have a farmer's almanac. You know that this was scheduled to happen. Anyway, Harrison, the governor of Indiana, unable to just convince people that this prophet is a fool, finds the serious problem. And so when Tecumseh, the brother, is off trying to organize this Indian confederation, he attacks the prophet's town in what is today Indiana. It's on a little creek. Anyone know the name of the creek? One of the most significant battles in American history, and its name lives on in political lore. Tippecanoe attacks the prophet's town at Tippecanoe, destroys it, and Tecumseh was quite furious, not necessarily with Harrison, but with his brother, because he told his brother, don't cause any trouble while I'm away. But his brother was his, well, those of us who have brothers, I think, share this. we have this uprising among the Creeks and among the Shawnee, and this is a troublesome thing for the United States. And one result of the war is the destruction of both the Creeks and the Shawnee. The Creek War in 1813, 1814, again, there's a prophet among the Creeks who had met with Tecumseh when he had come among the Creeks and starts preaching the same things. And among the Creeks, there had been a great deal of assimilation. That is, Creeks had married whites, and Creeks had adopted agriculture. They were growing cotton. They had cotton gins. They were doing the same things as their white neighbors. And they were living, well, indistinguishably from white folks, but they were Creeks. Now, a movement arises among some Creeks not to do these things anymore, to give up planting cotton, and so on. And a civil war breaks out among the Creeks. And the militias of Mississippi and Georgia come to defend these assimilated Creeks and also protect the road the United States government had built through the Creek country. And they build a stockade, which they called Fort Mims. And in 1813, Fort Mims, which has somewhere around 300 or 400 people inside it, mainly mixed blood Creeks, is attacked by a force of traditional Creeks, who also are mixed blood. There's been a great deal of intermarriage among these folks. And the massacre at Fort Mims, as it's called, I think we could rightly call it this, killed somewhere between 200 and 500 people. And the Mississippi militia proved itself unable to protect Fort Mims. In fact, the story is that the commander, it's anyone from Mississippi, by the way, because the commander of the Mississippi militia was told by a slave that the woods are filled with hostile Creeks, and he doesn't want people to panic. So he knows what will happen if word gets out that the woods are filled with hostile Creeks. People inside the fort will worry. So he has this guy blocked to stop him from telling tales about the hostile Creeks in the woods. Well, turned out he was right. In the hostile Creeks, the next day when the captain of the militia is playing cards with the other militiamen, the hostile Creeks stormed the fort, killed 500 people or so, and burned Fort Mims. This has the effect of raising militia from other places, notably Tennessee, and Andrew Jackson is the commander of the Tennessee militia, and he then waged a war against the Creeks, a war really of extermination. And in August of 1813, defeats the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, killing about 800 Creek warriors. So we have in the Creek War the largest, well, we'll use the term massacre of people by Native Americans, and then in Horseshoe Bend, the biggest defeat of Native Americans by American troops. And as a result of this, the Creeks are forced to cede 25 million acres to the United States. And it also mobilizes the Fort Jackson's forces from Tennessee, as well as the Choctaws, who were traditionally hostile to the Creeks and other forces. And they then are ready when this British Army comes to New Orleans in 1814, 1815. Okay, now, the important lesson of this is the defeat of the Creeks and the Shawnee opens up the West to American expansion. It secures Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Alabama, Mississippi from the native people, and the British pull out and will no longer support the native people in any war they may have against the United States. So that's one big outcome of the war. So if we were keeping track, Canada no longer is an objective for the United States. The Shawnee and the Creek are defeated. And then the next big thing is the area wrested from the Creeks is perfect for cotton cultivation, and cultivation of cotton expands after the war. By 1820, cotton is the leading American export, and the United States has become the world's leading cotton producer. India and the world's leading cotton producer before. Now, related to cotton being an essential thing, in New England, remember, New England had its trade disrupted first by the embargo of 1808, then by the war. In 1810, a New Englander, Francis Cabot Lowell, was in England. He had gone to England for reasons of poor health. It was a strange idea that if your health is bad, you go to England, but Francis Cabot Lowell did. And Francis Cabot Lowell, as he is leisurely taking in the sights of England, visits textile mills. And he has a phenomenal mind for details of industrial equipment. He studies the mills in Birmingham, Manchester, and he comes back to the United States actually during the war, and he and some associates, actually are called the Boston Associates, built a factory on the Charles River in Waltham. And the factory is a unique development. Well, it's a novelty. Traditionally, you would make wheat cloth. First you would, get a sheep and shear the sheep, and then you would have to clean the wool and card the wool. That is, run a card through it to straighten out the fibers, and then take the fibers, and women would spin the fibers into yarns. And then this yarn would be taken to someone by the loom and be woven into cloth. So you have this process that has a number of different steps: shearing the sheep, carding the wool, cleaning the wool, weaving the yarn, and then knitting. The Waltham factory does all of this under one roof, which is a revolutionary development. And all of the power is generated by the Charles River. And the factory, as I said, opens in about 1814, and they realize the water power of the Charles River isn't sufficient for their purposes, so they turn their eyes north towards the Merrimack River, and there in 1819, 1820, they built the city of Lowell to manufacture cloth. And by the 1820s, and until the Civil War, the Merrimack River Valley is the most heavily industrialized place in North America, or in the Western Hemisphere. So this is an outcome of the war. The fact that trade had been stopped by the policies of the Madison administration. And the Lowells, Francis Cabot Lowell dies late in the 18-teens, but his associates build this industrial enterprise. And then with cotton being produced in the southern states, city of Lawrence built really to weave cotton into cloth. Lowell tends to do more wool, and then other cities developed along the Merrimack River. This is another outcome of the war. The United States begins industrializing as a way of competing with Great Britain. The main questions, by the way, I fear that I just keep talking. Yes?
I missed the key because you're talking about the outcome of the war, but it looked for a period like the United States was losing the war because the troops were coming over and coming down and going up.
Yeah.
So how did we win?
That's a good question. How did we win the war? And that was perfect because it's exactly what I was going to start talking about now. We win the war in two ways. One is by building ships on the Great Lakes to prevent the British and the Canadians from coming across and resupplying. Now, we do have these great frigate battles early on, and I encourage all of you to go to the USS Constitution and the museum, which tells the story of this ship, which is the only vessel remaining from the war. It is the oldest commissioned warship still afloat in the world. But those frigate battles were not significant strategically. The British had about 1,000 ships. The Americans had about a dozen. So if we were going to take out the British Navy one by one, I mean, you can do the math and figure out how long that is going to take. Okay. And the British Navy, they're not stupid. They tell the British naval commanders, if you see an American ship, don't engage it. Okay, in the fall of 1812, they had lost 4 of these engagements. The previous 20 years, they fought about 300 or 400 engagements with the French, and I think they had lost maybe 2 or 3. And now, very quickly, they fight 4 with these people they don't really respect, and they lose 4 in a row. And they say, okay, we're going to stop doing this. What they can do, since they have 1,000 ships, is blockade the American coast. So the British set up a blockade in 1813, and that's pretty much the end of these great naval battles with the USS Constitution against her enemies, or the United States against the Macedonia. The American fleet is pretty much blockaded, except for one David Porter who had gotten into the Pacific, and he wipes out the British whaling fleet in 1813 before he's captured in Valparaiso. So what do? Now the British are blockading your coast. Well, you know their next step is going to be moving across the Great Lakes, so the United States sends its sailors who no longer can go to sea to the Great Lakes, where the Americans built fleets on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Isaac Chauncey is given the responsibility of building this fleet at Oswego on Lake Ontario, and Oliver Hazard Perry is given the responsibility of building a fleet on Lake Erie. So the Americans built fleets on the Great Lakes, the British also were building fleets on the Great Lakes, and the American fleets win. Perry defeated the British in the summer of 1813, one of the great naval battles of all, most important strategic, the Battle of Lake Erie. And Perry's flagship was the Lawrence. Told that because James Lawrence was the captain of an American frigate that had gone out of Boston in July of 1813 to take on a British ship and lost. And Lawrence's dying words as he was carried below deck were, anyone know what they were? Don't give up the ship. Right. And so Perry not only has his ship named the Lawrence, he has a blue flag with white letters flying from the mast that don't give up the ship. It becomes the Navy's motto. Lawrence's men did almost immediately give up the ship. So you have that. And it is this victory on the Great Lakes. Perry's victory at Lake Erie, and then in September of 1814, at about the same time, they heard this British force is moving toward Baltimore, that this huge British force is coming down the west bank of Lake Champlain, and there's also a British fleet built on the northern part of Lake Champlain. And at Plattsburgh, the British fleet and the American fleet fight, and Thomas MacDonald is the American commander. And he didn't want to face the British fleet in the middle of Lake Champlain, so he had to anchor his ships in Plattsburgh Harbor, or Plattsburgh Bay. I don't know if any of you have been there and seen this, but you also realize you're fighting these, don't need to tell you how he wins the battle. It involves turning ships around at a crucial time. So there's that, and that prevents the British from coming down Lake Champlain. And of course, the other thing is the British are not able to take Baltimore. So that's part of it. A big part of it is the fact that the Americans were able to mobilize during the war. As the Americans are winning these victories at sea, former President Adams was asked if he was surprised at the American Navy's ability, the fact that the American Navy had been winning, and Adams said not really, and then he realized that might be taken as a sharp, smart answer, and so he explained that in the early 1780s, when he was in France, an American-built ship had come into a French port, and the French Minister of Marine had said to him, the United States will become the world's greatest naval power because you have the capability of building better ships than anyone else. So this is something the Americans could do better than the British could. Build ships and also had better sailors. So it is the Navy that wins the war. But actually, more importantly, by the way, one of the good things about the War of 1812 is each side can claim that they won it. I know the Canadians say they won the war. The Americans, of course, well, we didn't lose the war, and the British can say they won the war. What happens is the Americans can say they won the war at the negotiating table. President Madison realized quite quickly that this was a mistake. They were in over their heads. They shouldn't have declared war on the English. And so he sends to negotiate. By the way, another person who was really unhappy when the Americans declared war on England was the Tsar. Why would the Tsar be unhappy with the United States declaring war on England? Okay. He did want England to be powerful because in 1812, Napoleon's armies are in Russia besieging Moscow. England is his one ally. And here you have your one ally now being distracted by this pesky war in North America. So the Tsar he had immediately, when he hears the United States declared war, he offers to arbitrate this because he doesn't want the British distracted. And he said, so he tries to arbitrate. No, every July 4th we celebrate with the 1812 overture, which a Russian composer wrote at the end of the century commemorating 1812. He's not thinking about our war, he's thinking about his war, or Russia's war. And you hear in the 1812 overture the strains of God Save the Tsar, and you hear the Marseillaise clashing, and then you hear, the cannon fire, the church bells as Mother Russia rises up to throw out the invader. It's a great thing. I don't know, you get chills when you see this every July 4th, and we're celebrating our independence, that Mother Russia rising up to throw out the invader. So Madison realizes the war might have been a mistake, but he's fighting the war. In fact, so he sends to negotiate probably the best diplomatic team the United States has ever sent anywhere. John Quincy Adams is the American minister to Berlin at the time, and of course he's the son of the former president, and he had been a senator from Massachusetts. He'd also been a professor of rhetoric at Harvard. So far, I think he's the only Harvard professor ever elected to the Senate from Massachusetts. Someone said he did lose the election in 1828, and someone said it was because he had written one too many books and learned one too many languages. Now, also on the delegation is Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. Remember, he's the guy who wanted the war in the first place. Very shrewd politician, and he will spend the rest of his life running successfully for president. And Adams played little bit of Adams like to get up at 4 in the morning. And his wife said this is the reason he fell asleep every night by about 6:30 or 7, because he thought it was really good to get up at 4 in the morning. And he also said there's sublime pleasure you get at that hour reading poetry in a language you don't quite understand. Very austere, but also a very capable diplomat. He would become Secretary of State, and he is really responsible for what we call the Monroe Doctrine. So, and he didn't like Clay. So they said Adams gets up at 4 in the morning, and that's usually about the time Henry Clay was rolling in, an all-night card game or drinking bout. And someone called him the victor of many a hard-fought battle. Also, Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury. And Gallatin, born in Switzerland, was a brilliant financier, the one member of the Jeffersonian faction who really understood finance. And very wise, shrewd diplomat. He later would become American minister to England. But he was, until Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt, he was the longest-serving Treasury Secretary in the history of the Republic. So, and also James Byers, Senator from Delaware. And so, very good delegation of Americans. The British don't take the Americans quite so seriously, so they don't send their A team to Ghent and Belgium to negotiate. And by 1814, at the time when the negotiations really underlay, the British realized the war in America has been a big distraction. They've been focusing on defeating Napoleon. Napoleon defeated in early 1814, then he gets out. He comes back to Paris, and the British realize what they need to do really quickly is just end the war in the United States so that they can go about their business in Europe, and also send their better negotiators to the Congress they're assembling in Vienna, which will settle the peace of Europe for the next 100 years. So the Americans win at the negotiating table. The British negotiators say, well, how about if we just go back to the way things were before the war? We won't keep any of the territory we've taken from you. You won't keep any of the territory you've taken from us. And all of those issues that brought on the war, free trade, oppression of sailors, etc., will result in boundary disputes. I mean, what are the boundaries of Maine and Canada? We'll settle those at some future point. We'll have a commission to settle that. So the Americans say, okay, no, we won't lose anything. We'll have this settlement after the war. And on Christmas Eve of 1814, the Americans and the British signed this treaty in Ghent, and then it is sent off to London to be ratified by Parliament and the King, and sent off to the United States to be ratified by the Senate. And so we win at the negotiating table by not losing. Now, the treaty arrives in Washington in January. Remember, in September 1814, or August of 1814, Washington had been burned. So President Madison is now living in a rented house in Washington. The Congress is meeting in a rented building, and news arrived from Europe. The British have agreed to a peace treaty by which we don't lose anything. The same day, news arrived from New Orleans that the British forces sent to the Mississippi River had been annihilated by Jackson's forces. The British lost something like 2,000 men in the Battle of New Orleans. The Americans lost 7. And it was a devastating defeat for the British. And the real winner was artillery, not the Kentucky riflemen, who actually weren't that effective. They were from Kentucky, I don't think unnecessarily. So you have this news arrives, peace and this decisive victory that actually happened about 2 weeks after the war had officially ended, or the peace treaty had been signed. The same day, actually, the delegation arrived from New England with the demands of the Hartford Convention about what we want to change if we're going to stay in the Union. So these guys, Harrison Gray Otis and others, who had assembled at the Hartford Convention to draw up their demands, which they were going to present to President Madison, who would have no choice but to accept New England's demands, find themselves in Washington, where Madison has gone from this bumbling buffoon who has brought on this war to the statesman who has brought about peace and victory. So it's a confluence of strange events here by which the United States can say, we won the war, because we didn't lose it, and we beat the British at New Orleans. Any other questions? Yes?
So hundreds of Brits build a shipbuilding industry hundreds of miles inland in the Great Lakes.
That's a good question. The same way the Americans did. However, the Americans had a big advantage because the British did have to bring cannon and other things across the ocean and up the St. Lawrence. So they had that disadvantage. Canada was less thickly populated than the United States. For the United States, it was a matter of bringing things from, say, New York up to Oswego, or assembling, things in what's now Erie, Pennsylvania, which then was Presque Isle, or Clifton Bay, which is in northern Ohio. So you have closer lines of supply for the Americans than for the British, who do have to ship things across the ocean. The Americans did a cannon foundry, or were able to develop cannon foundry and other things. But the challenge was to bring the material, a lot of the materials and the men there, because these areas, Oswego, Clifton Bay, Presque Isle, weren't that heavily populated. Nor was northern Vermont, where McDonough built his fleet. So the British have a bigger disadvantage there than the Americans. And but each side is able to build pretty good fleets on the Great Lakes. Yes?
I have a question that goes back. On Jefferson eliminating the death. What part held his policies enforce that?
Hamilton's policy really was to keep funding the debt. Here's the way it works. You buy government bonds. That's what the debt is. So you have bought these bonds. The federal government then pays you interest on your loans, essentially. And that's what the debt was in the 1790s, that investors had bought up the existing debt, and then the federal government would pay you, and this is why you would buy the debt. So Hamilton's idea was, this is a way of ensuring stability of the government, because if you have invested in the government, you will be interested in what the government does. You will be on its side and so on. So that was really Hamilton's idea. He probably didn't say the phrase is often attributed to him, that a national debt is a national blessing. It's a way of cementing alliances and so on. Boy, the Republicans really attack him for that. You can imagine someone phrasing a national debt as a national blessing, and if you're running against him, they need that. Political life in the 1790s was a lot more vicious than it is today. So Hamilton's idea was to keep funding the debt. Jefferson's idea was to eliminate the debt. So that by paying it off.
Yeah, and by not spending.
Not spending money. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, by rigorous economy, so that we will not take from the mouth of labor the bread it is earned.
Eliminating the Navy.
Eliminate the Navy. He had this idea: if you take these big ships and take them apart, and then when there is a war, you can put them back together again. And he also had this other idea. During the war with Tripoli, the United States had bought some small gunboats from the King of Sicily. And Jefferson thought, well, this is great. The Republicans, by the way, didn't think the Navy was a good idea. It's like you have these big, the Navy requires a great capital investment. And also you have all of these, you have to have a lot of men trained in the Navy. They still have this idea of the militia. These, honest farmers at the country's call would come forward and be able to repel any enemy. You can't do that on a ship because you have to be well trained. And so they feared that the Navy was going to devolve into aristocracy. And you would have this military cadre, plus the very expensive ships. As you said, the USS Constitution cost something like $600,000 to build. And this is at a time when the whole federal budget was just a couple of $1 million. So you eliminate these things, and you build these smaller gunboats, and they will be enough to protect the harbors and rivers, but won't leave, if you have this big military force, Jefferson thought, they can be sent across the ocean, people will get ideas, some president will have the idea of sending it off on some adventure, will get embroiled in wars, much better just to use it as a defense force. So instead of big ships like the Constitution, they'll be taken apart and put together again if we need them, otherwise we'll have these gunboats. Right. Now, the gunboats aren't that effective. You can't take the gunboat very far, for example. And one of the first gunboats was built down in Savannah, and there was a hurricane, and it wound up in a cornfield. And one of the federal newspapers said that it is defending the agricultural interests. And another said, our Navy, it's not the best on the sea, it is the best on the land. So one of the real ironies here is we have the Navy essentially winning the war, but the administration that brought on the war doesn't think the Navy is a good idea. So that's a curious thing. And one thing the naval commanders do is they make the Navy state from a Republican system of government. Because now Madison and Jefferson say, hey, you know what? The Navy really is pretty important, and these guys aren't going to become tyrants. In fact, after the war, there's an episode in 1818 involving Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. After the war, Jackson had invaded, he had chased some fugitive Creeks into Florida, and Pensacola was a Spanish port, which Jackson captured from the Spanish. The United States and Spain were at peace, and Jackson, as well as the Spanish, are harboring fugitives, so they won't do anything about it, I will. So he does take Pensacola. Now, the Senate worried about the concept, what happens if Spain declared war on us because we have this general who's decided to invade Spanish territory. And the cabinet discusses what to do about this. And every member of the cabinet says to President Monroe, you should fire Jackson. Everyone except John Quincy Adams says, no, the United States is going to get Florida eventually. So Jackson precipitated something that we want to happen. Now, the Senate, though, is investigating Jackson. One thing legislative bodies like to do is investigate things, and they do launch an investigation of Jackson, and they publish a report. At the end of the report, there's some letters suggesting that Jackson had friends who had land holdings near Pensacola, and it was in their interest, of course, for the United States to seize this. They don't come out and say this, but there's the evidence. Well, Jackson takes this for what it is, which is an attempt to besmirch his reputation. Imagine he would do something like this just for crass gain. And so Jackson is outraged, so he responds in the only reasonable way for Jackson, which is to say, I'm going to go into the Senate and cut off the ears of the senator who wrote this report. Now, mild-mannered elderly senator suddenly hears Andrew Jackson is coming to town to cut off your ears. This senator gets a permit to carry a gun. Because, and the newspapers are filled, and they track Jackson's progress from Washington. And Jackson is coming. And Jackson comes to Washington, and his carriage pulls up in front of the Capitol building, and he gets out and he walks to the door of the Capitol, and standing in the doorway is Stephen Decatur, who is the great naval hero of the war. And Jackson says to Decatur, stand aside, I am going to enter the Senate. And Decatur says, if you do, General, it will have to be over my dead body. And Jackson turned around and did not go cut off Senator Laycock's ears. So you have the Navy evolving into an instrument that is not going to threaten. Actually, one Washington wag says, it's kind of too bad that Jackson didn't attack Decatur, because that would have saved us from what he called Jacksonism. Anyway, I didn't mean to turn this into an attack on
this one.
Yes, sir.
Jefferson, did Jefferson cut back on the actual armies of,
Yes.
because he thought that the militia would take care of it?
Jefferson did cut back on the army.
There.
Yeah. On the other hand, Jefferson also was responsible for the founding of West Point. But he does believe the militia will be sufficient. He thought you needed a small regular army, but you should get by with militia in most other cases.
Is there any sense that Jackson knew that the treaty was already been signed?
No, Jackson no one would have known that the treaty was signed. And in fact, one thing the treaty says, this is the Treaty of Ghent, is that they give sufficient time. Because there were a number of naval battles that happened after the treaty was signed. In fact, the American commanders and British commanders don't know that the war is over. So they don't know. So if you fight a battle, I guess it would be really serious if you did know. But I don't know what interest is that, because you do start, if you pick a fight with someone, they could also win. So, one other thing about the treaty that's worth, the ending of the war, since it had been such a disaster, provokes a feeling of nationalism the country had never experienced before. Celebrations of a national identity. And part of this comes out of the fact that the war had gone so badly. In August and September of 1814, Washington is burned. The British are about to take Baltimore, and Francis Scott Key, watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry, wrote what becomes the national anthem with this question. There's questions in that first verse. Does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? It's a question. They're watching through the night. On the only evidence is when one of these British bombs goes off, and they can see the flag is waving at Fort McHenry. Key, by the way, he opposed the war at the beginning. He's a Federalist against the war. Washington Irving was also a Federalist against the war. He happens to be on a boat going from New York to Albany, and it's late at night. Someone gets onto the boat and said, "Oh, did you hear the British burned Washington?" And someone makes a joke about Jemmy Madison and Johnny Armstrong. Armstrong was the Secretary of War. And Irving was outraged. He says, "It's not Jemmy Madison or Johnny Armstrong's problem. It's your problem. It's our problem." And Irving immediately went to the governor of New York and offered his services. I always wonder what the governor would say, middle-aged writer. It says on radio, it depends to the death. Anyway, you have this outpouring of nationalist identity after the war. And it's almost universal. One area where it isn't universal is in the Massachusetts legislature. The Massachusetts legislature calls the celebrations of the peace immoral and irreligious. Imagine the time when the Massachusetts legislature worried about morals and religion. There they are. And actually, one of the documents that the Lincoln Historical Society produced was a series of toasts given at the peace celebration here in Lincoln. And as towns across the Commonwealth were ignoring the legislature's injunction to not celebrate the end of the war by celebrating the end of the war. And these are ceremonies where people would get together, and the way men used to celebrate, and sometimes, occasionally women would be permitted at these gatherings, but was through toasts. That we would all drink a lot as we were celebrating, but drink in a ritualized way, so that we will go around the room and each of us will propose a toast. You only see this now at weddings, and it's usually, the best man's already had too many, and he starts a rambling discourse. But then it comes out of this whole tradition of toasting. And so you toast something. So the toasts here begin with the United States of America. So that's what we will drink, and then the person explains what it is. Rise, Columbia, welcome, peace, etc. And then the event we celebrate, which is the peace. And the President and Congress of the United States, and we'll all drink to that. The Union of the States, the memory of Washington. John Quincy Adams and his illustrious associates at Ghent. And the door of the Temple of Janus, the Temple of War, is now closed. May the temple itself crumble to dust. That is, this is a war to end all wars. The officers and soldiers of the Army, officers and sailors of the Navy. And then the 10th article of the Treaty of Ghent Make Great Britain and America manifest to the world their love of justice and humanity. Does anyone know what the 10th article said, by the way? The American and British Navy were going to cooperate in ending the slave trade and patrolling against the slave trade. So, this toast says, may they do this, and by their exertions promote the emancipation of the African race. That really would have stunned the Madison administration to find that the goal of the war, well, Madison opposed slavery, though he owned slaves, was to end slavery. And then other toasts, the memory of those who have fallen. And Lincoln's hero, Major General James Miller, was also at this event, and he toasted those who fell in the last campaign. And then after he left, someone toasted him. That was the tradition. You're not in the room, someone toasts you. The Massachusetts legislature didn't like any of this. And one of the final pieces of this creation of the national identity, came in April of 1816 in Norfolk, Virginia. After the war, the Madison administration realized, yeah, Navy is pretty important. Where should we base the Navy? And Stephen Decatur, the fellow I mentioned a moment ago, went to inspect various places on the coast of, or on the Chesapeake where he could build a naval headquarters. And he thought Norfolk would be the best place to be the base of naval operations because it's close enough to the ocean. And it's also, he thought that if another invader comes, their objective is going to be destroying the fleet, not destroying anything further up. So the fleet is right there. They're not going to move further up. They destroy the fleet, and they do destroy the fleet. That's a bad thing. And there was one of these celebrating dinners. Every time Decatur, anytime any of these heroes came to town, we would have a dinner to celebrate. And there would be around these toasts. And Decatur's toast in Norfolk, people at the time took to be a slam against the Massachusetts legislature. The toast was, our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, and always successful, right or wrong. It's a sentiment. And Decatur recognized that the country could be wrong. He also recognized the fact that the country could fail, and he knew the consequences of failure. And that is one of the great lessons of the War of 1812. Thank you.
Could you say something more about James Miller and why he's famous?
I thought everyone knew. That's I was a little nervous coming in. James Miller was from Vermont, married someone from the town of Lincoln, and lived here for about 10 years. And at the battle we call Lundy's Lane, Miller was in command of a group of about 300 men, and the commander asked if he could take a British gun emplacement. And his answer was, I will try, sir. And so Miller took his men and discovered that to the left of this artillery emplacement, there were some bushes and trees. So he had also a rail fence. So he had his men get behind the fence and in the trees. The first group would fire, and then they would move up closer to the wall. The next group would come and replace them. And the British realized what they were doing. He started firing at the center of the line, but by this time, Miller and his men had gotten close enough. They were able to take this gun emplacement and seize a couple of dozen pieces of artillery and actually killed British soldiers who were protecting and then held off another British assault on this position. So it was that phrase, though, I will try, sir. He didn't say, yes, I'm going to do it, but you try. And so Miller is able to take this emplacement. Unfortunately, the Americans weren't able to take the guns out. They pulled back from this position, and the British did ultimately retake that little piece. But, you know, war is often like this. You have these very small strategic moves that in the long run might not have any great significance, but in the immediate term, yeah, the men did take gun placement, and Miller said that he could try.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Jason in particular for technology. I want to thank Jason in particular as chairman of our program committee, but also John Coles, Jim Cunningham, Joyce Titoro, and Chris Taylor. And I'd like to remind you that our next meeting will be December 2nd, and it will concern the cemeteries in Lincoln. And more on that later. So I hope to see you then. Meanwhile, thank you again for coming, and do grab something from the refreshments table as you leave.